What do you regret?
What do I regret?
Yeah, what do you regret?
Hesitating.
I regret it. I regret that. I didn't honor their moment.
Every single one-night stand I've ever had.
My name's Vanessa Brassey and I'm a philosopher at King's College London, where I study art and the emotions. In other words, I'm interested in what makes a painting regretful. And I'm going to be talking in detail about two particular paintings. The first is a Rembrandt self-portrait, and the second is this beautiful but heartrending Claude Monet. And I'm thrilled that I've been invited into the National Gallery to do this, where I can actually stand in front of the paintings and talk to you about them. But you might ask, why am I asking a picture to tell us about regret? After all, regret's a human feeling. I could just ask some other humans.
Regret combines different perspectives in really interesting ways.
Philosophy of Mind Professor Matt Sartorio from King's College London.
The most obvious perspective that it involves, I suppose, is a perspective on time.
But pictures can tell us about regret too in their own way. The question is, of course, what way is that?
So I'm making a film and it's all about regret.
So regret, it's feeling bad or sorry or regretful about something that you did. I mean, it's a feeling.
Some pictures tell us about regret by showing us the negative feeling that sometimes tracks with regret. Those negative feelings can feel like a magnet that are made out of guilt, shame and sorrow, one that clings to us painfully. So here, for example, we can see in this beautiful painting by Rubens, Delilah and her lover Samson, looking very elegant in the foreground. But for those that remember the story, at this point, Delilah and Samson have indulged in some kind of pillow talk, where Samson has revealed that all his strength comes from his long, glorious hair. And Delilah has just betrayed that knowledge to the authorities, who are waiting outside to pick Samson up and subdue him. When you look carefully at the picture, you might notice that in the background there's an old lady emotionally withered, as if internally enduring her shame and corrosive guilt, looking on at the younger Delilah. Well, that's meant to be Delilah as she is older, looking at herself. Delilah's kind of regret is tied to a moral failing, but this is not the case for all our regrettings. In fact, many, if not most, have no ethical dimension at all. We might just regret, a wild night out or knocking our phones while in conversation.
Jesus, I just opened the camera.
So it makes sense to think of a spectrum of regrets, where each type shares some kind of essential feature.
You could think of it maybe as a perspective on a past episode that has this halo of possibilities that kind of haunt present.
So we should think of regret as a kind of orientated feeling towards our personal past. A past which is set in stone, but is soaked in possibility. Tiffany Watt-Smith tells us in her book, The Book of Human Emotions,
there's something seductive about regret, the way it paints an aura of possibility around what has been broken. It's rarely a comfortable state of mind, although it can contain a flicker of pleasure and a strange, if temporary, sort of relief.
And some of my own regrets are like this. They're a mixture of pain and pleasure, really. I can think about the fact that I partied too hard in the 90s or encouraged my children to venture overseas. Those kind of regrets are mixed with camaraderie, kindness, and even pride. And that gives us this clue as to what Tiffany Watt-Smith is talking about when she talks about this mix between pain and pleasure. On the one hand, you have these negative feelings involved in regret, but on the other, it's tinged very much with the pleasure of possibility. So the second way that pictures can tell us about regret is just to show how it looks right on the face of someone that's feeling regretful. And that brings us to our first painting we're going to look at in detail, this really astounding Rembrandt self-portrait. And I can't urge you enough to come down here and look at it yourself. It makes a massive difference to see it kind of in the flesh, as it were. But you might wonder, why would Rembrandt look regretful? What would he be remembering and recriminating about? And of course, we now know that at this point in his career, Rembrandt had lost a lot of what he'd gained through his genius, his family, his fortune, and his fame. So why might he recriminate? Well, perhaps he feels residual guilt for the untimely death of his children, the loss of his fortune, and the trend away from his particular brand of genius. Because even though his contribution to these things seems neither voluntary or deliberate, at most, he might recognise himself as the unwitting, intermediate causal link in a chain of events he regards as deplorable. It's almost like he's a driver whose car was hit from behind and gets shunted forward and hurts the people in front. You regret it, but it's not tied to a moral failing. But where might the flicker of pleasure be found?
Well, the pleasure is knowing you had is coming to terms with the fact that you weren't a perfect person, and that's okay too. And I think there's some things that you just don't come back from. There's no redemption.
And that brings us to the third way in which we can find regret in pictures. It seems to me really clear in this particular picture that Rembrandt's finding pleasure in articulating his regret, in his power to articulate it in paint. This can sound a bit tangential to the original idea I just proposed, as if the act of painting regret provides some kind of cathartic pleasure in recreating it. But I don't think that quite gets it, at least when I look at this painting. I think what's going on here is that it's the pleasure of painting the regret that's bound up with these flickers of pleasure, because it's the pleasure of recalling his power and his family, despite what all this has led to. In other words, his regret is suffused in an irrepressible delight at having this power at all, and it's a power that's still very much apparent in this later self-portrait. And that brings us to a fourth way in which pictures can show us regret, a way that is slightly more mysterious.
When friends of mine started to get married, I should have never missed any of them.
But you told that lie to protect someone you loved?
Yeah, but the sweet thing is you protected someone you loved.
That's the sweet thing, yeah.
So the fourth way in which pictures can tell us about regret, I found in this beautiful pondscape by Monet. It seems to me that when I savour the soft pink light dappling across the twilight water, I can find regret lurking in the lily pads and in the dark, downward reflections of the willow trees. And this is, of course, a bit strange because, unlike the Rembrandt, there aren't any narrative cues in this picture to tell us that someone is feeling regretful, and yet the picture quite powerfully conveys regret. So whose regret is it? One might wonder whether there's a missing person in this picture, someone that's just wandered out of frame. Or you might think maybe it's the man behind the brush himself, Claude Monet. The question is, how did he get his regret into this picture here? So I think there's two interesting ways in which Monet puts regret into the picture. The first is his use of colour. So if you look at the picture at the top left, and the left side of it, he's used a preponderance of kind of happy pigments, is what we'd call them. There are some cadmium red lights, there's some warm yellows, there's the very powerful ultramarine. And these he uses often in his previous pictures to kind of sing out pleasure at the landscape. So you've got the kind of pleasure notes there. But these are being chained down by earthy umbers, raw umbers and ochres, earth colours, on the right of the picture and down to the bottom. And that's kind of giving us this mixture of pleasure and pain, the top notes chained down by these more sombre bottom notes. Second, composition, the combination of still twilight water, a pond that has been cultivated, but now seems to me lonely and abandoned, and the unusually darkened colour chords work together to convey how Monet's regret feels. And the genius, I think, of Monet is displayed in the vantage point that he uses. It gives us a very particular perspective on the scene. And you'll see here that we're hovering slightly above the pondscape, looking down on it. And that's incredible, given that we're completely preceding the age of cinema, because what we've got here is the epic ending swoop shot. The camera's panning up into the air from where we might see, in a film, crashing boats or the ceaseless flow of urban life. And in this way, it preempts the swooping shot. It's giving us a perspective that emphasizes the quicksilver character of life. It locates us somewhere poised between past and future, echoing the way regret preserves and perpetuates the present so that we can try and recover and hold close our valuable past despite the slot machine rapidity of the change we live through. And it's this that makes pictures part of our essential kit for living. They're modelling human experience insightfully in ways that prepares us for our own future regrets. They allow us to empathise with Monet, specifically by entertaining this universal perspective, one shared by all humans, one that is caught in a ceaseless loop between past love and present grief and future hope. So interestingly, the picture itself becomes a mixture of pain and pleasure. On the pain side, we have the sort of grief-riddled toxic glue holding Monet to a past he's not ready to give up. In that way, it's kind of an ode to time spent in this very loved garden with his much-loved and now lost wife. But there's pleasure in there too, the pleasure in this obsessive interest in painting dusk, in the garden, celebrating and holding close that very relationship with his wife. Mixing pain and pleasure, we feel the regret. Monet is alleviated from merely negative feelings towards a past that is fixed. Instead, he finds liberation in the halo of possibilities that propel him forward to remake the future world in a way that satisfies some of those unrealized pathways. Weirdly, we can just see these feelings articulated in the verdigris. It's broken up with tantalizing notes of nostalgic amaranth, it's tinged with fading wonder, and it's shrouded in the warm reds of cadmium light and those buttery Naples yellow. But perhaps you disagree. Maybe you think that what I'm reaching for isn't regret at all, but some closely allied emotion. Not regret, but just something more like nostalgia or reminiscing. But to that I reply that I do think it is regret, because only regret considers the past by taking these pause points. It's a raft that we can clamber onto, in which we can consider the past, gauge the value of it, and orientate ourselves towards the future.
So there are those episodes of regret act as a magnet in a rather negative way, that we kind of cling us to them. But it can be valenced with anticipation.
I mean, when people say they don't have regrets, I always wonder if what they mean is, I don't have regrets that make me unhappy.
Can be one way in which regret can have this positive dimension to it.
And it's bittersweet pleasure. It's one of the mechanisms through which we can hold those that we loved and no longer with us close.
In a sense, a complete view of the past includes both what did and what could have happened. But the possibilities are often left open, and they point futureward, even when they are embedded in our past. Regret resists closure, but by doing so, it revives the past into the present. Part of those regretful reminiscences, of course, involve past emotions. The emotions we felt then can become pleasurably tangled in our current yearnings, and that recolours some of our feelings into something much more alluring than repelling, a rueful reliving of emotion that's not entirely unpleasant.
We naturally think of regret as a perspective on something that's happened in our past, but because it has this affective dimension to it, it's an emotion. That temporal perspective can be inflected by an evaluative perspective that kind of implicates what matters to us.
In this way, regret keeps open lines to our painful past that are not exhausted by negative, painful feelings. Regret pulls our past into the present so that we can once again hold it close and imagine the embrace of those people we can only access through it, the people we wish we could have done better by or for. Regret brings the flicker of pleasure one might feel when restrained by a weighted blanket or a bond, because regret affords us the ability to reconstitute those people or events that bring value, meaning, and shape to our lives.
That's a nice little spot to end things.